Okay, so thank you this morning. Thank you, Paul. And what we want to do right now is we don't have time really for another break. But just in a moment, I'm going to ask you to stand and kind of stretch your legs and such as that before the Q&A. What I'd like to do right now is when you came in and registered, there was someone who Lisa gave an IOU because she didn't have change. And so you can cash that IOU in right now for $5. And if you don't, then I'm going to write an IOU and cash it in myself. No. So what we'll do now is we're going to take about 5 minutes. We ask you not to leave because once we disperse, it'll take a lot of time to get back. So just stand up. Everybody, you can go ahead and stand up and stretch your legs. And we're going to set up the stage here, and then we'll start the Q&A time. So if somebody could bring these 2 chairs. Tried to cash in an IOU, didn't actually happen. All right, so here are the ground rules again. I want to go over them, okay? This is not the opportunity for you to have your own conference. You were a little frustrated because we didn't invite you to be the speaker, so this is a question and answer time, and Jeffrey and Paul will be answering the questions. I'll be taking the place of Phil Donahue. So just kidding. So I'll run. If you have a question, if you would raise your hand and you can ask the question into the microphone, then we'll have it, as part of the recording. Yes.
Can we get Paul to move over a little bit?
Paul to move
more
over
into the light. He's in the shadows.
He's in the shadow.
Thank you.
Probably, if you're in the light.
Okay.
Stay in the light.
All right, so
all right, very good. Thank you.
Here we go. All right, so Jim.
Just a very small, easy question at first. Paul mentioned that the Hebrews shared a language with the people of Canaan, and I just wondered what that was. It didn't seem like that would be Hebrew.
Yeah, I mean, there is, of course, Aramaic is spoken. Because you have the kind of the language that is going there. You have, for example, Hezekiah when Jerusalem is surrounded. He says, speak to your servant. Speaking, the Hebrew language is being spoken, but he says, speak to your servants in Aramaic. Because it wasn't as well understood by the people who were leaning over the wall in Jerusalem and listening to what was going on. But you do have Aramaic, but again, you do have people who are speaking in the land of Canaan. You do have them speaking this language. I mean, of course, Abraham was there in this land. He was living among them. His children and grandchildren grew up there as well. So they were and then this was passed on in the land of Egypt as well. So.
Yes.
I know the topic of justice is a fairly complex one, but could you give us a definition of justice as it applies to the topics that you've talked about today?
I mean, justice has to do with giving to a person what is due to him, and so when you're dealing with the perpetrator of what is wrong, then what is due him is punishment. Those who are innocent, what is due them? Protection. That there are certain, and again, we've talked about certain overriding, issues such as you may have overriding considerations, say in a terrorist attack, and a plane is hijacked and so forth, and what is generally to be done may need to be superseded by averting greater calamity. But basically, justice having to do with giving what is due to all parties. I don't know if that's it's a kind of a simple beginning, but that's the starting point to kind of get our feet into the discussion.
I do want to mention that Jeffrey has joined us in the Q&A specifically because of his expertise in church history and history, and we also wanted to bring some questions in related to the Crusades, because that often comes up. So,
I'll just mention this too. In the book, Did God Really Command Genocide? There are, and I'll just just to fill you in on this as well, and Jeffrey can mention the Crusades and so on. But in the the chapters of the final chapters, it's does religion cause violence? Are Yahweh wars in the Old Testament just like Islamic jihad? Did Old Testament war texts inspire the Crusades? And turning the other cheek, pacifism and just war, some of the things we talked about. So there's more to it than just the Canaanite question. But anyway, just want to let you know that that's in the book as well. So.
To make up, or to follow up on Bruce's question, just as a finer point, you make a distinguishing commentary, or you offer a distinction between justice and equity in the book, or do you see a distinction between the two?
Yeah, I mean, we could. I could.
Or Jeffrey, either one.
Yeah. I mean, Jeffrey, I don't know if you want to jump in. I'm happy to do that, but I want to get Jeffrey in on the conversation. But you're welcome to.
Why don't you go ahead and address that?
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, again, justice having to do with giving each person his due, and of course there is a certain the factor of equity that you try to treat well. For one thing, the image of God is informs us in treating people as God's image bearers. And that we, as we engage with one another, we take that into account. But some people may forfeit certain rights because of the behavior that they're engaging in. And so, for example, the Nazis, when you're hiding Jews in your basement, well, Nazis who want to come to take innocent life, they forfeit their right to the truth because of the evil intentions that they have. So again, there are some distinctions to be made here, but there's a kind of a general layout of what that looks like.
I think another distinction that's probably germane to the general topic is drawing the distinction between the use of force as opposed to violence. Now, I think this is one of the Achilles' heels of the whole pacifist argument. They refuse to distinguish oftentimes between a prudent use of force and violence. To them, they seem to imply that all application of force is analogous to violence, and that strikes me as unrealistic and a distinction that we probably need to emphasize.
All right, so my actual question, instead of following up on Bruce, yes, yeah, that was Colin, was going back to Dr. Copan. Earlier in your first session, more so than the second, you talked about the term literally. The Bible says literally that we should wipe them out, the hyperbolic speech and all the rest of it. And I wondered whether or not, since all of the scripture written is literally written as it's written, or you can say it's written literally, how do we make the distinction? If you have a point or two we can consider when we read it, that there's something about that some principle involved, that we shouldn't take the term wipe them out totally to literally mean what it says.
Right. Yeah. Again, quick answer is we do address some of these themes in the book. What I think it's helpful to distinguish between taking the Bible literally and taking the Bible literarily. That there are certain portions of Scripture we just don't take the Bible literally. I mean, when Jesus says, "Tell Herod that fox," now he's not thinking of some furry mammal. When we talk about the trees of the field clapping their hands, we're not talking about something literal here. What we ought to do is understand that the scriptures are written in different genres or types of literature, and that these genres are like contracts that exist between an author and his reader. And the author is assuming that as he is writing in this genre, you will interpret him accordingly. And if you, for example, Revelation is, chapter 4 through the first part of chapter 22 is highly symbolic. This is called apocalyptic literature. And so you basically flip historical narrative principles on their heads, whereas in historical narrative you take something as historical unless you have good reason for taking something figuratively. Whereas in Revelation, in this apocalyptic section, you assume something is symbolic, unless you have good reasons for taking it literally. I mean, that's really how it works. You need to understand the genre. Some people have a one-size-fits-all, oh, I take the Bible literally. Well, actually, they don't. And I talked with someone yesterday, and he was, we were talking about, well, I said, he said, we need to take the Bible literally. I said, well, do you believe that the earth rests on literal foundations? No. Okay, well, then I think we understand what we're talking about here. So I would emphasize, some people say, well, but it seems so clear that the Bible is talking about utterly wiping them out. Well, we also have competing texts that say that they weren't all wiped out. And some people say, well, it seems so clear that maybe we need to question whether Jesus rose from the dead. That maybe it wasn't a bodily resurrection. Well, you look at what the Gospels say, and it's a uniform witness that, Jesus, the tomb was empty. Jesus says, touch me and see that a spirit doesn't have flesh and bones as see I have. That repeatedly Jesus is emphasizing the transformed physicality of his body. The witness is uniform. It's not as though, Jesus, you ask me how I know he lives within my heart. And that's all there is to it. No, the tomb was empty. This is the uniform witness, and so we need to keep that in mind as well, that we're dealing with different genres in Scripture. So thanks for asking a good question.
And some Bible scholars will draw a distinction between taking the Bible literally or literarily as opposed to literalistically.
Yeah,
so,
true.
So here's the question here.
Considerable
Yes, would you?
is to read and interpret Scripture rather simplistically. And again, to come back to that point, they would like to argue that all application of force is analogous to violence itself. I feel like this is just unrealistic. They have provided, of course, at times, a very powerful witness to contain the use of violence and warfare and so on. But personally, I was never a philosophical pacifist. I've always found that position to be untenable, and frankly, it can be irresponsible, I think. Well, as Paul indicated, perhaps even immoral in certain circumstances.
Yeah, but to their credit, I think they do remind us, and other Anabaptist, others in the Anabaptist tradition remind us that we always need to be engaged in reconciling activity. We always need to be engaging in building relationships. That we need to be engaged in proclaiming the gospel that brings about transformation. We need to be seeing, are there creative ways in which we can engage to minimize hostilities and misunderstandings and so forth. So there is I think there is a healthy emphasis that they give to it, but again, I wouldn't go the whole way in endorsing that way of thinking. But it is good to remember.
I think if I heard your question correctly, you were also asking whether they had, in so emphasizing the peace, that they had actually compromised the gospel itself. That,
Well, they seem to emphasize peace, but nothing on the
gospel.
evangelistic
Gospel side of it.
Well, that's not so typical of traditional Anabaptists and traditional Mennonites, but it is typical of a lot of the newer generation. Since the 60s, there has been a general forfeiture, I think, of evangelism in favor of peacemaking. So I think your point's valid, especially as it applies to younger Mennonites today.
One question that I often hear is, either one of you can comment on this. Okay, in the just war tradition, that there are always unintended consequences from the use of force or violence. And so once we allow for the use of violence, that these unintended consequences will sort of create unjust situations where innocent people are suffering because of the use of force or violence. What do you say to that?
So you're going to sure.
In our booklet on natural law, the moral foundation for social and political civility, we have an appendix there on just war theory, a little bit of, it's basically a brief history of just war theory, as has Paul outlined as well. We conclude that section with this comment: just as these just war principles have been generally acknowledged in theory, they've regularly been violated in practice. In fact, just war theory has always been more of an ideal than a reality, and once an armed conflict begins, the rules of engagement are very quickly, oftentimes, ignored. Nonetheless, like the Ten Commandments or any other moral code, the principles of just war are useful and undoubtedly have had some tempering effect on violence and inhumanity perpetrated in at least some wars. And for that, we should be duly grateful.
Yeah, I'll jump in too. That there are, certain. There's a presumption often in this discussion that in war there's this absolute rule that all because all innocent life all people have a right to their preservation of life and so forth, that any time that is violated, that therefore this is unjust, and therefore just war cannot be sustained because it will often carry with it certain unintended consequences, namely the death of innocents in these sorts of situations. I think it is helpful to distinguish between death is always an evil. Death is always an evil. That it is not, there's this cemetery that is near us in Palm Beach, near Palm Beach Atlantic University, and has this crazy line that says, anything so universal as death must be a blessing. It's just, it's totally cracked. Anything as universal as disease must be a blessing. It's just kind of fluffy silliness. But death is always an evil, even when someone dies a natural death. That is an evil. It is not something that is seen as we should see as good. Now, when we're talking about when anyone dies in a warfare situation, who is innocent, yes, that is an evil. But the point is not to try to intend that evil. And we need to distinguish in the matter of intention. Are we intending to cause this evil? When a murderer wants to take someone's life, his intention is to do something that is directly evil. And so just war does make this kind of distinction. The intention is not to to choose or to desire. We don't desire this evil. But sometimes these evils will result, and so there is room for making these sorts of distinctions here. And I think a lot of people, when they dismiss just war, they say, "Oh, it's all evil." Well, I think there are some important nuancing that needs to be done, and I would simply refer people to Nigel Bigger's book, In Defense of War, which goes into a lot of detail, which also talks about just surveying attitudes of people who are soldiers in warfare, that they're typically, is not a certain animosity that they have against their opponents, and a lot of times people think that war is driven by hatred, by anger, and so forth. No, it's often driven. It's often driven by protecting one's loved ones. It's driven by yes, you will have people who do evil, people who will invade other lands like Putin and so forth. They will engage in all kinds of evils, but I think when we look at, say, our nation, the allies, and there hasn't been that kind of animosity that because a lot of people think that animosity or that hatred drives people to warfare, and I think that's just an unfair charge. So anyway, those sorts of nuances are important to discuss in all of this, but we can only be very brief here. Yeah.
All right, I want to go back and close the loop on the wiping everybody out question, because I think it's clear from Scripture that the Israelites did not utterly destroy their enemies. What's less clear to me is that our jealous, holy God was speaking figuratively instead of literally when he gave some of his commands. And in particular, I say that because it appears that a lot of the problems the Israelites had throughout the Old Testament history was because they failed to wipe everybody out, and then they had the problem of intermarriage and the foreign gods and all that sort of thing. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, they failed to drive out the people, for sure. And of course, because of their religious compromise, God told them that they were going to be driving them out slowly so that the land would not be overrun, by wild animals and so forth. But again, notice the point that I'm trying to make here, and I think this really hones in on the specific issue. Remember I said, right toward the end of my first talk, that Moses says, utterly destroy them, leave alive nothing that breathes. We see in the book of Joshua that he carried out all that Moses commanded. And we see, again, a lot of survivors in Joshua and, of course, Judges. Well, if Joshua is indeed carrying out all that Moses commanded, it seems that we do have, I think, ample room to say that Moses did not intend this to be literal. But again, the primary thrust is to drive them out, to dispossess. That is the major impulse, to remove them from the land so that they will not have this kind of an influence within. Because if they remain the dominant culture in the land, the Israelites will be swallowed up in that, and so the goal is to drive them out. And so this is, so it's a kind of a two-stage sort of thing. But again, I think about the emphasis on Joshua carrying out all that Moses commanded and how that cashes out in the book of Joshua and the book of Judges.
Well, what did God command? That's the question.
Pardon?
What did God command is the question.
What did God command?
Well, God, what Moses commanded.
I understand what Moses said.
Well, when God says he's going to utterly destroy the Israelites or the Judahites in Jeremiah 25:9, is he thinking in terms of totally obliterating them? Clearly not. Read the end of the book and you see that's not what is on his mind.
So what you're doing is you're not making a distinction between what Moses said and what God's intention was in this case, because Moses is representing God's perspective, which is that he's to drive them out. And you're saying that synopsis of the situation, which was that he carried out, that Joshua carried out all that Moses had commanded, is actually saying that Joshua did what God wanted Moses to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Hey, all the questions so far have come from this side. Is there anybody over here that has a question? Hey, one over here, and then I'll come back.
And I want to follow up right where we were. One of the first acts the Israelites did when they crossed the Jordan was the destruction of Jericho, with the exception, of course, of Rahab and her family. So that's a total destruction, as I understand it. So going against the drive out theory, that you're talking about.
Yeah, you do have 3 cities that are highlighted that are burned with fire. Only 3. You have Jericho, Ai, and Hazor, but that's it. Those are the 3 cities that are burned with fire. But keep in mind too, you have them going to these cities, engaging these raids, and then going back to the base camp, which does suggest, as Kenneth Kitchen says, these disabling raids that are more than just this total conquest. Remember too, you've got just from archaeology in these places, we don't have indication of a massive destruction here. We have some that is a gradual infiltration. So that's, again, the evidence points to that as well. There's a book edited by Daniel Block, who's an Old Testament scholar, who it's on ancient Israel, whether this is kind of a myth or reality. I can't remember the exact title. I do mention it in the book. But in this book it does have a chapter on this whole thing that takes a couple of hundred years for this kind of a shift to take place. This is exactly what the archaeological record shows, that it wasn't this sudden military incursion, utter destruction, but it is a gradualistic infiltration, and that is reinforced by Judges 1 and 2, where they could not drive them out, they could not drive them out, they could not drive them out.
And in your book, Is God a Moral Monster? If I recall correctly, don't you make the case that Jericho was probably not a large city, but more of a fortress?
Yeah, and these are military citadels, and as I did say that they were where the military, political, and religious powers were, and it was also used for storing grain. So you didn't have civilians there. You don't have kind of status pottery found in these places, but this is the first line of defense for the people living in the hill country. So these were citadels, and Jericho's probably had about 100 or fewer people within it. So it was a smallish fortress.
So just back, I'm over here.
Yeah.
So just back to what I think people are kind of struggling with is like your descriptions of the archaeology and all, what really happened versus what ought to have happened. I think some people are assuming that, yeah, you can describe from the book of Joshua or Judges, what did happen, and that wasn't this, conquering of everything and, over. Yeah. But what God wanted to happen, if they had really trusted God and put their faith in Him wholeheartedly, was they would have all been wiped out.
Or they should have been driven out. That was the main impulse. That was the primary objective, to drive them out of the land.
Well, I think what I know
and if people were left behind, they left themselves in harm's way. Yeah.
Okay. So I think what the tension is I think some people are saying that, I know you're using it for the driving out, but they're seeing the text where it says destroy, and they're not buying your figurative hyperbole idea, and they're saying, no, what God wanted them to do was to kill them all.
Well, then they're left with the problem of how do you keep side by side, drive them out, and wipe them out. If you drive them out, you're not wiping them out.
Well, when Muhammad was conquering, when the Muslims came to a town, they gave them three possibilities. You can stay and fight, and we'll wipe you out. You can flee, and we won't chase you. Or you can convert to Islam, and you can become one of us. So,
you're saying that was the strategy of the Israelites too?
I'm saying was that God's intention was, okay, they can flee, but if they don't flee, then God says slaughter them all, because I want the board erased.
Well, I mean, remember the primary the primary goal is to dispossess them, to remove them from the land that the land has been given.
Yeah.
And yes, if they do stick around, then they leave themselves in harm's way.
Yeah.
They open themselves up to death. Yeah.
So I think that's where the tension is that God would even if now we've got fewer people that we're actually doing it to. I think what people are struggling with, and what people struggle with, is even if there's only 2 or 3 of them left, the fact that you go in and say kill those people is, there's a tension there. And hence, someone asked me to ask this question, which was, how do you define genocide? What would you give as a definition of genocide?
Yeah, I mean the genocide is it's the intention of destroying a people, and so it is to remove them from existence, and so what we have here is again, if the emphasis is driving them out, and I do stand by that, and I think the scriptures do emphasize the language of dispossession, and again, which stands in distinction to death, that this is what they are to be they are to be thrust out, and the Canaanites too have their own warning, namely the signs and wonders that God has done, and that the people from like Rahab knows, that the people from Jericho are aware that this is your God trumped the gods of Egypt, brought you out of through the Red Sea. The Gibeonites know this, the Philistines know this in 1 Samuel chapter 4, that this is the kind of God, and this is the God who is accompanying His people by these amazing signs and wonders. So there is certainly a sobering, serious warning that if people resist this, then they will be harmed. So we do say that this is a unique situation, one that is unique and unrepeatable. And we talked about that that there may be innocents who are harmed, and that and that if this happens, with God's commands, that God issues these commands in these unique situations of supreme emergency or overriding considerations, such that a good God who is commanding this good and just and God is doing so with morally sufficient reason. And so we need to look at those pictures as well, and look at, again, I'm trying to broaden our horizon rather than, in a sense, focusing on, well, what about this? Well, I have tried to unpack a larger case. And so if you're only going to focus on this, I think you're missing the bigger picture.
Yeah. And I'm thinking that actually, as you mentioned, the signs and wonders and all that, and they're resisting then God in light of the signs and wonders. In that sense, they're equivalent to the Egyptians who have seen the signs and wonders, and they come after Israel. And so they know God is with these people. And so at this point, they're actually opposing God. So once they hear, okay, God is on the move, He's with these people and all this, and they don't heed the warning, now they're actually opposing God.
Yeah, excellent point. Yeah, and I would say too, Jesus engages in the same sort of language when He talks about the destruction that is coming to them because of their own resistance to Jesus. Matthew 11, woe to you, Bethsaida and Chorazin, if the signs performed in you had been performed in Sodom, in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented in sackcloth and ashes. And so Jesus warns them that that there is this judgment coming. It is going to be widespread and significant, and it's going to mean a lot of loss of life, women and children included.
So speaking to the question of Christians serving in the military and the police force, certainly the state has been given the power of the sword to enact justice and protect its people. But what about in a situation where the state cannot be relied upon to wage war justly or to use the police to actually enact justice?
Yeah.
Can a Christian still, in good conscience, serve in a position where he could be bound by those the state to act immorally?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just speak quickly, and feel free to jump in, Jeffrey. I think where the Christian is going against his conscience, he should not act. And if he knows he is doing something that is contrary to what is right, he should resist. Like the My Lai massacre or something, to engage in that would be wrong. And you say, well, I'll take the consequences, but I'm not going to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Ultimately, our accountability, we answer to God, not to the state.
Yeah.
I thought Paul was absolutely correct in pointing out that this issue of Christian pacifism prior to Constantine is, frankly, it's an ambiguous issue. There's a lot to be considered. Now, it is true that we read accounts of Christians serving in the Roman military prior to Constantine, but we don't read of any Christians voluntarily joining the military. Now, again, we can't really make a case conclusively from silence. Perhaps these Christians serving in the Roman military prior to Constantine, perhaps those were new converts to Christianity. They converted while they were soldiers. There is no evidence of Christians voluntarily joining. But again, that does not make the case for pacifism, certainly. That's just a historical fact to be taken into consideration.
Well, moving along in history a bit, if you could address the Crusades, especially in light of what Obama recently brought up at the National Day of Prayer, and how as we Christians that we can respond to that in an intelligent way, because this frequently comes up with those that we meet.
So I guess the question there
take a shot first.
The question there goes something like this: isn't the Crusades just the equivalent of
the Christian equivalent of
jihad? Yeah.
A few things to note, and again, I touch on this in the book. I deal with 5 myths pertaining to the Crusades. One of them is that the Joshua-Deuteronomy text inspired the Crusades. Actually, it was the words of Jesus that were most often quoted, not Joshua and Deuteronomy. The words of Jesus about laying down your life for your friends, or about giving up everything for Jesus and so forth. All of these statements of Jesus are being appealed to. Another myth is that that it was a pursuit of wealth. If you wanted to get wealthy, you'd go to Spain. You wouldn't go to the Middle East. But basically, what instigated it was basically a response, a defensive response to pilgrims Christian pilgrims going to the Holy Land and being disemboweled, being women being raped and so forth. There were all manner of atrocities that were taking place on the part of the Muslims in the land who were engaging in these sorts of acts. And so Christian pilgrims going there were being persecuted, were being put to death, were being brutalized. And so it was it was a response to this sort of a thing. Again, Europe at this time had been dealing with all manner of instability and battles on other fronts that they couldn't address the incursion of Islam into previously Christianized lands. So remember that there was a context to the Crusades. It wasn't as though, the Muslims were just there minding their own business and bam, all these Crusaders descended upon them. These were Christianized lands first that were taken over by Muhammad's followers, and that this was a defensive response. Primarily, were there abuses? Sure. But I think the greater weight is that this was a defensive response. There were several attacks within Turkey that again during the time of the Crusades that actually launched these crusades that were a response to these assaults. There are several historians of the Crusades who lament that the word is out, that the kind of the received mythology is that the Crusades were this unjust attempt at going into Muslim lands where people were minding their own business and they had no business being there. It was actually these lands that had been once Christianized, that had been taken away, that Christians were being brutalized, that pockets of Christians were that places where Christians lived that were being attacked by Muslims. So it was largely a defensive response. Again, I'm not saying there's a pristine moral response, but in large part it was a defensive and I think justified response to what was going on. So take a look at the book. There are also other references that I give to these we look up on these books on the Crusades that give another perspective on this.
I think among the historians that try to deal with Crusades honestly and fairly, and that excludes many historians on both sides of the issue. As Paul said, Christian pilgrims were being harassed and oftentimes brutalized in their attempts to get to what they called the Holy Land. Also, there were a lot of the holy sites that were being desecrated by the Muslims as well. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in particular, but other sites as well. So among historians that, again, try to be honest and fair in dealing with this, some would make the case, as Paul said, that this was a response to several centuries of Muslim aggression and conquest and persecution of Christians. Others would argue that not so much was it a war, defensive war, as it was a war of liberation to try and liberate these sites from, again, Muslim control and Muslim abuse. But of course, even that point is morally pretty problematical to argue and defend. But yes, in some sense, defensive wars, series of wars, in other cases, they were wars of liberation, at least in the minds of the Crusaders themselves.
Okay, so question here.
Looking at the just war principles, specifically the lawful declaration, I was wondering, what about the case of revolutions? For example, the American Revolution, would that be considered unjust then, since it doesn't?
Yeah, I know it may disappoint a lot of people, but I don't think the American Revolution, as patriotic as I am, as much as I love to go to Boston, Massachusetts, and celebrate. I mean, I love America, but I don't think that it went by a just war theory. Was there abuse? Was there oppression? Yes, but not rising to the level of revolution.
Our friend Stuart McAllister would be glad to hear you say that.
Well, as an American historian, I would agree with Paul. If you apply the principles of just war theory, it was a war that can scarcely be justified on those grounds. Now, there have been wonderful results from it, as everybody would agree. But there are a lot of things that happen historically that aren't necessarily justifiable, but have God uses them in a very redemptive way. And certainly that's been the case as far as the American Revolution.
Okay, I have to make a disclaimer that I wasn't here for all of your presentations, so I don't know what you covered. I had other responsibilities. But
Thanks for your labors.
Thank you. So, one of the stories that I've always kind of struggled with from the Old Testament is right after the golden calf incident and the Israelites that are killed in judgment for their participation. And the sense that, you know, we're someone today to say, God has called me to kill these people here in the church because they're not, you know, standing with him. We would say that person is not really hearing from God. And so that sense of struggling with a God who would command the driving out or the wiping out, or, you know, even of his own people, the judgment, that seems different than the character of God that we talk about with our children, that we would want to raise them and to discern what he is leading them to do. I don't know that I'm phrasing this question very well, but what does that say about how we explain what God is like to our children?
Okay.
So let me just say that I've tried to tell Lisa that it's okay for me to say to our children, the wrath of God is, I'm going to bring the wrath of God on you. No, anyway.
Well, I don't know if you want me to address the incident specifically or just give general guidance on, you know, how do we help our kids to think through these issues.
Well, the golden calf incident, right after that, if you've got a response to that.
Okay, well, I did mention the issue of treason, that this is actually the very undermining of Israel's own identity and mission in engaging in this. Here, it's like God has just made this covenant with Israel, and it's like committing adultery on your honeymoon. You know, here God has just made this covenant, and now the Israelites are engaging in this kind of activity that undermines the very covenant that God has made with them, that undermines the mission that God has given to them to be a blessing to the nations, that undermines their identity as the people of God, to be his, those who worship him and who are to be a blessing to the nations, that look at them, as Deuteronomy says, and see the wisdom that the nation of Israel embodies. So there is something that is very significant going on here, and I think maybe we just don't understand the gravity of what this covenant that God made with Israel signified. We also, as we come to say Jesus, I think a lot of people say, well, Jesus is safe. Let's go to Jesus. Well, Jesus is very severe. Jesus is. I think let's introduce them maybe through the Chronicles of Narnia to talk about Aslan. Remember when Lucy wants to know what Aslan is like, and Mr. Beaver, she says to Mr. Beaver, is he safe? And he said, who said anything about safe? But he's good, I tell you. He's the king. And we see in Jesus someone who is not safe. He is good, but he is. You see. Romans 11:22 says, "Behold the kindness and the severity of God." There is both kindness and severity. Jesus shows kindness, but also great severity. He is the one who brings. He talks about judgment. He talks about God in terms of bringing, coming crashing down. The Romans coming crashing down on the Israelites in AD 70. He is one who talks about hanging a millstone around the neck of those who mislead these little ones and drowning them in the depths of the sea. Very strong language that is here. And so I think it is important for us to remember that God is not, I think we like to think about God as a nice God, and recognize that God is not one who is tameable, that we need to be tamed by him, that we need to be following the footsteps of Christ, that as we look at how God looking at God's attitude towards sin, looking at how God is both compassionate, welcoming, and so forth, a friend of sinners. But there's also a severe side, and we need to be, there is the language in the New Testament as well, that our God is a consuming fire and so forth, that there are sobering reminders. And so there's a certain tension that we need to keep in mind. And then as we read the New Testament, we see that there is a ramping up of both love as well as severity. Both of them are seen. And I think highlighted in particular in the cross of Christ, we see both the wrath of God, the severity of God in taking sin seriously, but also the immense and immeasurable love of God that is so great and that ought to consume us as we are motivated by the kind of love that has been shown to us. And I think teaching our children that the Christian faith is a religion of gratitude. That we live in light of grace, we live in light of, and helping them to distinguish between, that we are accepted before God on the basis of what Christ has done, but we still need to live lives that are pleasing in God's sight. So acceptance, that's been taken care of by Christ. But living a life that is pleasing in our sight, that is a relational category. And so we want to please those whom we love and live in light of what the grace has been shown to us in Jesus Christ. But again, it was in the Old Testament too, in terms of the gratitude factor. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. So there is this grace picture and then the gratitude result that comes from that. So anyway, that's just a couple of things that might be helpful.
I'm sorry, but would you characterize the Declaration of Independence as an unjust document?
Well, as I said, I love the Declaration of Independence. I think it's, I quote it, but my point is that if we're looking at just four categories and we're comparing the American, seeing how the American Revolution stands up to that, I'd say it does not measure up to those standards, and that's just something we need to come to just watch the John Adams series, and I love that series. I love the remarkable sacrifice that was made on the part of our founding fathers. I love the colonial and Revolutionary War periods, and I understand what motivated them. I would disagree with what they their revolutionary ideals, but I'm very grateful for a lot of principled people who sacrifice so much, and we are the beneficiaries of that. It's a mixed bag.
The Declaration of Independence, Lou, as you know, is actually two parts. Part one, the part that we revere so much and quote, is very high-level political discourse drawn from natural law theory and also from Enlightenment classical liberalism, the popular political ideology of the day. And again, to the extent that it reflects natural law concepts, it's extraordinarily inspiring. Now, as you know, part two of the Declaration is a list of grievances against England and against King George in particular, and that is primarily propaganda. There's elements of truth in it, obviously, but there's an awful lot of exaggeration in those grievances as well. So it's an interesting document, and rightfully so. We're inspired by part one.
But it's not
go
God
back
breathed.
and take a look at part two.
Yeah, it is not God breathed.
Yes. But it was Thomas Jefferson breathed.
Yeah.
But there tends to be a distinction between the two.
Well, I think you can see the interest that these topics have generated and how interested people are. It's actually past 12:30, and so I want to thank both of you for your answering questions, and Paul for your presentation. Sure. So let's give them a hand. I could see this happening again and continuing further with some of this discussion, Paul. This
sounds good.
Provided good. we prohibit all questions related to the Declaration.
Okay. I was thinking that maybe if you if you had something to contend about that, you could rush the stage afterwards. No, I'm just kidding. Oh, hold on, just a minute here. So we'll break in just a minute, and I invite you to stop by the tables over here. We got some sign-up sheets.
We have to sign books if you want.
Yeah, we got only about probably 10 books left, and there's a sign-up sheet, and we have a few spaces left for the C.S. Lewis Fellows Program, so if you'd like to participate this year, you can let us know about that, and thanks for coming.
All right, and thank you.